Good morning. This is Chair French convening the regular business meeting of the Kansas Corporation Commission for May 19th, 2026, joined by my colleagues Commissioner Keene and Commissioner Keither. On today's agenda, we have a consent agenda consisting of 38 items. We have one noticed order for our consideration, and we have one discussion item, which will be our quarterly update on Southwest Power Pool activities. So we will begin with our consent agenda. Commissioners, you've had the opportunity to review those 38 items. Let me ask at this time if you have any questions, beginning with Commissioner Keither
No questions, thanks.
and Commissioner Keene.
None for me either, thank you. I'd move approval of the consent agenda.
Second.
All right, we've got a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda. Is there any further discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed, say no. The consent agenda is approved. With that, we will now move to our one noticed item. This is in docket number 26 TRAM 0341 MIS. And this is a proposed order opening docket and for issuance of a subpoena in aid of an investigation. And our presenter for this item is Mr. Hassan Latif. Good morning, Hassan.
Good morning, Commissioners. As you said, the order before you opens a docket for the purposes of issuing a subpoena ducis tecum to Sunflower Electric Power Corporation. On April 1st, the Transportation Division opened an investigation into Kansas Dirt Incorporated after a complaint was received by transportation staff. Kansas Dirt is a for-hire motor carrier operating out of St. John, Kansas, and has been the subject of several roadside inspections by the Highway Patrol, where repeat violations were found, including drivers using operating CDL required vehicles without a CDL or being medically certified. During the investigation, Kansas Dirt has not been able to provide staff with documentations of the loads it's hauled, but they did inform staff that they hauled loads for Sunflower. And as a routine part of the investigation, the special investigators requested Sunflower provide documentation of the loads hauled by Kansas Dirt on its behalf on April 13th, pursuant to KSA 66-1,108C. That statute grants commissioner investigators authority under the Transportation Division to inspect and examine any and all books, accounts, papers, records, property, and memoranda pertaining to the regulation of motor carriers. To date, Sunflower has not been responsive to staff's requests for documents as part of its investigation, and therefore staff requests that the commission issue this order and then also issue the subpoena ducis tecum to Sunflower Electric Power Corporation, ordering the documents relevant to the investigation and pursuant to staff's previous requests be provided. I'm available for any questions you have.
All right, thank you for that description of the order, Hassan. Are there any questions on this item, beginning first with Commissioner Keither?
No questions.
And Commissioner Keene. Commissioner Keene, you are muted.
I guess you didn't hear me. Sorry about that.
We got you now.
No questions. I'd move approval of the order. Pardon me.
Second.
All right, we got a motion and a second to approve the order as described in this docket. Is there any further discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed, say no. The order is approved. Thank you, Hassan.
Thank you.
All right, with that, we have concluded all the orders up for our consideration, but we have now come to our final agenda item, which is a quarterly Southwest Power Pool update, and our presenter, as always, is Justin Grady. Justin, you've already got your presentation up. It looks great, so I will just let you take it away.
All right. Hey, good morning, everybody. Well, it's nice to start this off without any technical difficulties, as is not typically the case. And just in case, that sets an expectation of a super high expectation for this morning's presentation. I hate to disappoint everybody, but I was out of the office sick with the flu each of the 5 days of last week, and I'm about 85 or 90% right now. So apologies in advance if this isn't, the traditional dynamic, gregarious presentation that I would normally present. And if I have to cough, I mean, you'll know that, it's genuine. So all right, with that, get into the agenda. I mean, it's the standard typical update for the SPP quarterly update. We'll go over the business meeting agenda items from the recent regional state committee meeting that was held in Albuquerque, New Mexico on May 4th. And as well as the board of directors and joint stakeholders. Well, the board of directors and the members committee meeting, they met the next day on May 5th. And then I've also got a care team update. The materials are in the appendix, and the care team, which, just a quick reminder, as an acronym test, is that's the cost control and cost evaluation. I'm sorry, cost control and cost allocation, evaluation, and review team. So that's we'll just talk a little bit about the care team and what we've done so far and what is to come. Looking forward in terms of a roadmap for the rest of the year 2026. There's also some updated sort of high level information on how the ITP, the 2026 ITP, is progressing, that I hope to have an opportunity to talk about as well. So this is the highlights of the business meeting. These are each of the individual voting items that we'll discuss in more detail. Just as a reminder, you can, if you ever want to flip back to this slide in the presentation, you can see the way that the vote shook out. There was quite a lot of consensus, I would say, during this RSC business meeting this year or this quarter, but not everything was unanimous. So I'll try to remember that and point out once we talk about each of the individual business meeting items, I'll try to point out what the votes were, but I don't have it listed on each of the slides as we go through this. So just as a reminder, you can go back and see who voted, and generally we call out the no voters and if a state abstains. So the first issue, and maybe the most substantive issue on the RSC business meeting agenda, was the establishment of the planning reserve margin for planning year 2032. Just as a reminder, the way that cadence works now, there is a loss of load expectation study that is done every year by SPP staff. And every year, SPP staff is either setting a 10-year, purely informational, 10-year out, purely informational planning reserve margin level, and sometimes they're doing a lot of these things at the same time, and or setting a 7-year initial setting of the planning reserve margin, or a 4-year final setting of it. So as an example, the 2029 planning reserve margin, just as a quick refresher of where the numbers stand today. So in the year 2026, the planning reserve margin right now, the requirement is for a 16% summer capacity cushion, what you can think of a planning reserve margin as, right? Additional generation that's required over and above your anticipated summer peak load. So today that's a 16% planning reserve margin in the summer of 2026, and this winter 26 and 27, it will be a 36% winter planning reserve margin. That changes in 2029 to a 17% summer PRM and a 38% winter PRM. There will not be any changes to the 2029 planning reserve margin. One of the biggest stakeholder pain points and concerns over the last 3 or 4 years in the wake of Winter Storm Uri, as SPP has identified the need to increase the planning reserve margin for reliability purposes, when those changes have occurred in the past, a primary criticism of the stakeholder community, mostly the load serving entities that have to build generation to meet these requirements, was that these changes were taking place too quickly. That there wasn't enough of a ramp, a lead time in order to build generation. And so one of the key changes that has occurred over the last 2 or 3 years is that that's no longer the case. So basically the earliest, I guess I'll say the shortest lead time change in the planning reserve margin that happens now is 4 years out from the study time period. So the 2029 PRM will not change at this point. The 2030 PRM actually could change next year with the 2026 loss of load expectation study evaluation. So this slide is actually wrong. Andrew or Chair French, you and I haven't had a chance to talk about that, but if you notice during the business meeting, that sort of oscillated back and forth depending on which presenter was talking. But I went and verified this, and it is still possible for the 2030 PRM to change based on the 2026 loss of load expectation study that would be finalized in, first or second quarter next year. So this, as a reminder, these PRM numbers were based on the 2025 loss of load expectation study. I take the kind of time to go through the PRM discussion like I do because it's a big deal. It affects every load serving entity in the entire 17 or 21 state region, depending on which balancing authority you're talking about or which interconnection. And this makes a difference, right? These numbers moving 1% or 2% make a difference in terms of how much generation load serving entities are required to build and maintain and operate. Ultimately, it affects rates, it affects affordability, and it affects reliability. So it is important. As a reminder, the loss of load expectation study is it's a probabilistic, modeling heavy evaluation. It's an engineering study using real world weather data from the last 43 years, using everything that SPP knows about the transmission topology that exists today, all of the resources that are online, all of the load that's projected, any asset retirements or additions that are expected in the next 7 years. And they say, this is the amount of excess generation that you have to have online if you want to meet the expected reliability standard of 1 day of loss of load in 10 years, or in other words, 0.1 day per year. And so for the year 2032, there was basically, again, they were evaluating 2 years during this period of time. So they're evaluating the 2030 initial setting, and they're evaluating the initial setting for 2032 as well. And for 2030, the expectation, the math showed that the number could stay the same, stay the same relative to 2029, right? Again, remember, we're going to bump up in 2029. The loss of load expectation study said we can stay the same for 2030 at 17% and 38%. And then for 2032, the math, if you followed the pure math of the loss of load expectation study, it said, okay, based on the changing resource mix, based on the improving generator performance during recent winter storms, a whole host of changes, including higher load factor customers that are anticipated during that period of time. The initial math supported that the PRM could go back down to 16% in the summer and 36% in the winter. And there was a lot of concern amongst the stakeholder community and amongst regulators, myself included. I was a pretty significant driving voice on this issue before the cost allocation working group. There was a lot of diversity of opinion, but I really did not like the fact that if if the 2032 PRM was first set at 16% in the summer and 36% in the winter, that we would be jumping from, we'd be increasing it in 2029, keep it flat in 2030, and then dropping again in 2032, all while we are, there's an incredible amount of uncertainty in this industry right now, right? I mean, everybody knows that, you know, you imagine, you think about 7 years out trying to do an accurate forecast. 7 years ago, nobody had heard about ChatGPT. We were still talking about closing coal plants because we had excess capacity. I mean, you know, the world, it's such a dynamic place nowadays in the energy policy industry. It changes dramatically every year to 18 months, it seems. And so there's just way too much uncertainty, in my opinion, to set that PRM level lower, to sort of send the signal that maybe we don't need as much generation 7 years out. It just wasn't intuitive. It didn't seem like it was supportive of the general direction and the policy changes that have taken place in this country and in the middle part of the United States since Winter Storm Uri and some of those other significant winter storms. And the other, I think, really key point is that the final setting of this will be evaluated in 2028, right? So in just a couple of more years, I know 2028 seems like, you know, that should be like 10 years away, but it's like 2 years away. So in another couple of years, the region will have the opportunity to reevaluate and do a final setting of this planning reserve margin. And I think, you know, the general consensus, and actually this ended up being 13-0, a unanimous vote at the Regional State Committee. There was a little less consensus than that at the Cost Allocation Working Group. And ultimately, you'll see the Markets and Operations Policy Committee actually could not come to a consensus in terms of whether or not it would be, you know, the right number is 1738 or 1636. But ultimately, what I think ended up winning the day was, you know, given, that's right, I remember the other point. The other point was that it's a lot easier if we find ourselves 2 years from now, all of the math still supports 1636. I'm going to be supportive of lowering the planning reserve margin. You know, it's much easier to deal with a little bit of excess generation. You can sell that to your neighbors. You can make profit that goes back to retail customers. And it's much easier to deal with the situation of lowering the planning reserve margin than finding yourself in a situation where you have to increase it because you've been too conservative in your planning. Okay, so I didn't plan on spending that much time on this slide, but this is a really important issue. It's probably one of the most important issues that we deal with is resource adequacy and reliability. Chair, I saw you came off mute. I'll give you an opportunity to say anything you want.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll wait till you do this next slide. I think you already presented a lot of this, but I was just going to give them some context on my vote. Well, why don't you do this slide and then?
Yeah, thanks. So, you know, I think this pretty well summarizes it. Probably should do the disclosure right up front again that I literally stole every single one of these slides again from SPP presentations, either to the RSC or to the board. They do a pretty good job of you know, distilling down and summarizing the key points. But you can see the COG Cost Allocation Working Group approved the 1738. There was no real controversy on the 2030 PRM at all, but for the year 2032, you can see Cost Allocation Working Group approved the 1738. But the Supply Adequacy Working Group, which is made up of mostly of load serving entities, some of the development community, but it was more like a 51-49 type split. It was very lot of diversity of opinion, very evenly sort of split vote. But they voted to no, let's follow the math. Let's go down to 1636. Ultimately, at Markets and Operations Policy Committee, you can see that the COG supported keep the number at the 2032 number at the same as 2030 for stability purposes did receive more support, but a passing vote at MOPSI is a supermajority. So if you do not get 2/3 of the votes, then it fails. And so both of these recommendations failed. Ultimately, the RSC and the board made their decision based on COG's recommendation and also SPP staff. There was no MOPSI recommendation. But ultimately, this did pass and it passed 13-0 at the RSC, which was surprising, because I think that's probably the first unanimous planning reserve margin vote that the RSC has had. I mean, it might not be. Maybe 2029 was close, but all right, that's it. That's all I have.
Oh, I think I'm mostly going to repeat things you're saying. But you know, this was a little difficult for me, and probably we shouldn't have had this much angst over a 1% change in the non-binding PRM, but we all thought about it a lot. I mean, just as a reminder of what Justin said, I mean, this was for setting the 7-year out PRM, which is binding, but it really is just informational, because you do the final setting 4 years out, and that's the number that people actually end up having to comply with and could potentially be subject to deficiency payments on if they don't comply with. And so the purpose of this 7-year out PRM, kind of like the 10-year out, is really to give people an indication of where the numbers are headed, and you know how they need to be conducting their long-term planning. And you know, so my initial thought, you know, like Justin said, there were a lot of people that just said, hey, follow the math. And that was actually kind of my initial thought, because I thought, you know, it does send the indication that some of the actions we're taking, you know, there have been improvements to the existing fleet. There have been, we've got a lot of new generation planned, that is, you know, at least on paper, is going to, you know, start generating before that 2032 timeline. And so, you know, I thought, well, it should give people an indication that, you know, we're doing the right thing, and those numbers could potentially be coming down. I ultimately ended up, I mean, as evidenced by the unanimous vote, ended up kind of going back the other way. I agree with what Justin said, that there is, especially when you're talking about that little small of a change, that is very sensitive to a lot of things. I mean, like I said, a lot of that generation, it could come online in 2032. We've seen lots of generation very easily get delayed and pushed back a few years. And if that gets pushed back, well, then these numbers aren't right. You could see large load additions come on that aren't in people's planning workbooks yet, and that could change the reserve margin requirements. All, you know, load generation, all of this goes into that LOLE modeling assumptions, and can impact the outputs quite a bit. And so there's a lot of uncertainty as to where this number is going to land once we finally get to the 4-year out number. And so, you know, as Justin said, if we go down 1% and start to send a signal that maybe people don't need to be building as much generation, and then you get to the 4-year number and say it goes up, say it goes to 18%. I mean, I don't know that that's likely, but say that happens, then you're 4 years out. Everybody knows you can't build generation in 4 years. You know, you've potentially sent a signal for people to back off and put them in a situation where nobody could comply. And so, you know, I think all the stakeholders are well aware of what the numbers are, where they're trending, the fact that, you know, we are doing a good job of getting more infrastructure planned. But I think everybody at the end of the day was a little uncomfortable moving that signal down when there are so many sort of large uncertain factors still circulating. And so we thought the safest course of action was to stay at the numbers we're at for the 2032. But again, it's going to be reset. You know, as we get to the 4-year number and we set the firm number, you know, that'll be the actual number. And if the math, you know, continues to show that it's trending down, if everything's on schedule for new generation, I would fully expect that planning reserve number to ease down a bit at that point. So I think I just repeated everything Justin said as far as the, you know, stakeholder debate, but that was also kind of the debate I had in my own head. and ultimately, got aligned with everybody else in the RSC. So, a lot of discussion over a planning reserve margin number that isn't ultimately the number that people have to comply with at the end of the day. It's more of an indication, but just to show that we all thought very hard about it before we took that vote. So, okay, that's all I was going to say, Justin. Thanks.
Yep. Yeah. No, I appreciate all the color. And we'll talk a little bit about this through the presentation as well. But just a little more emphasis on a primary driving factor behind the math that was showing up in the LOLE study, that we can actually lower this potentially. A big part of it is that there's like 13,000 megawatts of brand new thermal gen that's expected to be online between that 2030 and 2032 timeframe. And there's a lot of question in the industry as to whether or not that generation can actually come online fast enough, whether it can come online in the time frame that the load serving entities are anticipating. There's a lot of question associated with supply chain delays and labor availability. And there is also a lot of question about whether the transmission that is anticipated in the models that is necessary to hook up that generation is actually going to be built in time. So there's a slide that we'll talk about later that I'll make sure we hit on. And if you want to flip ahead, it's in the appendix, and it's called contingent facilities analysis. And it's a situation where once a transmission line or a transmission plan gets approved by SPP, that goes into the modeling that the engineers, the resource adequacy engineers and the transmission planning engineers at SPP are assuming will be the case. And so if it says, well, we're going to have a 765 kV line online and in service by 2031, then what the model might show is that, and you'll see in this slide, there's 13,000 megawatts of thermal generation that is listed, or not thermal, not all thermal. There's 13,000 megawatts of generation that has at least one transmission line within the plan that's a contingent facility. And that just means if that transmission line doesn't come online in time, if that transmission line doesn't get built at all, then you can't hook up that generation, right? And if you do hook up the generation, well, then maybe you can only run it at 20% of peak. And it's all engineering calculations, but it is a reality. And I think it's just one additional, all of that kind of thinking and background is what goes into one bullet point: transmission build out timing uncertainty, but it's real. And there's just a lot that has to come all together in this country and in this part of the United States over the next 3 or 4 years. And it's all got to work, almost not perfectly, but it's all got to work in tandem. And there's a lot of uncertainty. All right, that's enough. Okay. We're going to speed up quite a bit here. RR 745 was the establishment of a planning reserve margin for the West, for the RTO West. And so as a reminder, SPP did expand its RTO boundaries into the Western Interconnect on April 1st, 2026. That RTO expansion, you'll see it RTO-E. Unfortunately, that doesn't stand for RTO East. That stands for RTO expansion, which is very complicated, but it really means RTO West, right? And it's was it 4 states, Chair, that were added when Colorado, Utah.
Yeah, that sounds right. And then a couple from the east are also in the west.
Arizona, yeah. And so I guess this is probably a pretty good opportunity for a reminder. It is one RTO, but they're separate balancing authorities. They have relatively limited connectivity right now through something called a DC tie. The Eastern and Western Interconnect are on different, whatever it is, different phase
Synchronization.
different synchronization, different timing in terms of the generators. And so you got to go through these DC ties in order to be able to import or export power. And it's very limited right now. And importantly, they're separate balancing authorities. So if there are, additional generators that are needed for reliability in the West, then those states, make the decision to build additional generation and they pay for that. If there's additional transmission development planning activities that occur in the West, then those states make that decision and they pay for that. But so it's only in the, I think, somewhat rare instance where there's a policy that will affect both sides of, the entire RTO, both sides of the balancing authorities, both balancing authorities, both interconnects, West and East interconnects, that everybody votes at the same time. In any case, there was a lot of unanimity, a lot of consensus regarding what the appropriate planning reserve margin should be for the West. You'll see it's quite a bit higher than the East. It's 19% for the summer and it's 40% in the winter. And this is something I was going to mention on our last slide, but I thought, how can I possibly spend any more time on that slide? But when the debates that occur within SPP to move from 16% to 17% or 15 to 16, it's significant. And it does drive billions of dollars of capital investment. But I think it's a good idea to remember that a lot of individual utilities in this country plan for a 20% summer planning reserve margin. In fact, the other day, I was reviewing the court case, the appeals case on the Wolf Creek nuclear plant back in 1984, 1985, and the planning reserve margin that utility was using at that time to plan to keep the lights on reliably was 20%. So it was really interesting, and I think it's a reminder of the kind of value of being able to share resources within an RTO. The reason that the planning reserve margin is higher in the West is because it's a smaller system, because it has less diversity of resources, because it's not every utility within those 4 states. It's a few entities within each of those states that have decided to join together and pool their resources. And so there's a higher planning reserve margin over there. They have to build more excess capacity, more excess generation. But in any case, it was approved 19% summer, 40% winter. This is another element of this revision request that had to be voted on for the East RTO members, and it's the ability to do a non-firm import study. So the reason that this came up is because in the West, those entities are, I guess I would say, limited enough in nature. It's a small enough footprint that's being added. And I think, honestly, it's just a reflection of sort of business as usual in terms of entities within the Western Interconnect. They are heavily reliant upon non-firm imports from their neighbors to meet their reliability requirements. Now that's always been a pretty controversial issue in the East. For the most part, balancing authorities throughout the Eastern Interconnect do not plan to meet the reliability requirements of their citizens during the hottest day of the summer or the coldest day of the winter, based on the hope that there will be non-firm imports that can come in. Non-firm being, of course, non-firm. You don't have any contractual rights to that. You just hope that the excess capacity is available. That's been a pretty controversial issue. There is some non-firm import consideration that's occurring within MISO today. A lot of discussion about whether or not we should start to consider the ability for these non-firm imports, and importantly, whether any of the interregional transmission projects that are either planned or that may actually be built improve the ability to do the non-firm import into the region, and therefore potentially can lower the planning reserve margin and result in an affordability win for customers. So basically the West PRM that we just talked about, it includes the ability to do non-firm imports. And the East, the reason that this language change had to occur is because the business practice model today explicitly says the loss of load expectation study for the East will not consider non-firm imports. And that there's, the opposite of that is occurring in the West. And so it ignited a lot of stakeholder discussion. And ultimately what was approved is that there will be a non-firm import study that is part of a sensitivity that's going to be conducted as part of the 2026 loss of load expectation study. And so it's not going to maybe set the base planning reserve margin, but it's going to be information that's available that stakeholders can use to debate and argue whether or not this is something that stakeholders want to rely on and want to use to set the planning reserve margin. Go ahead, Chair.
Is now a good time for me to make a couple comments about this? Or do you
Absolutely.
want to
Yep,
do the
yep.
next? Yeah, so I actually think this was maybe one of the bigger deals. It flew a little under the radar at the business meeting, but this concept of non-firm imports, it sounds super technical, but it's like, let me describe it this way. What we're really talking about is if you remember during Winter Storm Uri or some of the later winter storms, but Winter Storm Uri in particular, we talked about how there were a lot of hours during that storm where the region did not have enough generation to serve load, but we were importing, I think it was up to like 7,000 megawatts from MISO and PJM, and that's a lot. That's multiple large coal plants worth of energy that we were importing at that time, and those are non-firm imports, and because we're not contractually, we don't have the rights to them, but they are available to flow in times of need. And so the discussion is, hey, look, there are imports coming in every day, and particularly in times of need, they will flow into the region, and they do contribute to reliability in such a way that maybe we should be considering these because they are a resource. I mean, they might not always be 7,000 megawatts. They're probably not going to be, but depending on the analysis, it might be 1,000 or 2,000 megawatts, and so. I mean, that is a real number that contributes to reliability. And from a consumer perspective, if that number is real, and you can, and the math under maybe say an ELCC calculation says that you actually can count on 1,500 megawatts, that reduces the amount of new generation that load serving entities in the region are going to have to build, because it would put downward pressure on the planning reserve margin. And so, if I'm a customer, and that's real, I kind of want it to be included in the calculation. And so, as Justin said, they're going to do the calculation. It's not going to necessarily set the PRM in the East, but it's going to be a sensitivity that we could look at, and we could say, hey, there is some excess here that might make us potentially choose a little lower number than we otherwise would have. Or maybe we see that it's a really material number, and we say the next time we set this, we do want it to be contributing to the PRM. So as it was explained to me, the West is a little different. They have a history of relying on some non-firm imports from some very specific resources that they have very high confidence that those resources are going to be available during their times of need, because just the way that their balancing matches up. And I wish I had the actual numbers in front of me right now, but when they ran the study, and with and without those non-firm imports, I mean, it dramatically decreased their planning reserve margin numbers. I don't recall Justin, what did they land on? They landed on 19 and 40.
19 and 40, but it
Yeah,
was huge. Yeah.
Yeah, without the imports, it was like 25 and 55, or I mean, it was something much higher. So those not looking at non-firm imports can have a dramatic impact. As we've talked to SPP staff, I think their feeling was for the East, it was going to be less dramatic. We probably would be talking about 1% change or less. But at the end of the day, they can be very important. Building interregional transmission potentially could be a cheaper option than building more power plants within the region. And so, just thought it was smart to start looking at that as an option, and potentially, it could help us either plan better interregional transmission or accredit the transmission that's already there and better value it. So I like where we ended up with it as a sensitivity, so we can kind of, I think the words I used were dip our toe in the water and understand the value of what we might have and what we could potentially build, and could it be a cheaper option for customers. So that's that whole discussion, but I think it is a really important topic. And what I really wanted to convey is it really goes back to Winter Storm Uri and those imports during some of those extreme winter storms, and us. It was on the roadmap to try to value that in some way, and I think that's what this is trying to do. So sorry, Justin, that I just wanted to make sure I added that context, that this could potentially be a big deal in the future.
No, yeah, it's good. A little additional context to just to highlight, for the world, where a few of the areas that you and I don't completely agree on every issue. Now, I mean,
Don't say that to anybody.
no, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'll just point out that it was, you're absolutely right. There was like over 36 hours that the region couldn't serve its own needs during Winter Storm Uri. That just doesn't get enough focus. But and it was also the loss of those imports where when the neighboring RTO got too tight, that ultimately led to the requirement to do load shed in SPP, right, for the first time in 80 years. So it's an issue with a lot of robust policy discussion surrounding it. I guess the other thing I'd say is, even without planning for the need, even without assuming that we will have these non-firm imports, as we know, there have been several really close calls since Winter Storm Uri where we didn't have load shed, but again, the region could not serve its own needs with firm imports and resources that are within the region. So there's varying levels of comfort with that kind of an issue, right? But I mean, a really good concrete real world example, I think that people should at least consider, and maybe there's going to be diversity of opinion about the issue, but it needs to be considered, is if both SPP and MISO have a 20% planning reserve margin, and sometimes at these seams there will be utilities making decisions of, should both of us build a brand new power plant, each of us on each side of this seam, just because we're not in the same RTO, or maybe we can build a 100-mile long transmission line and share one generating unit. Those are the kind of real world decisions that something like this will impact. And building a power plant nowadays is a couple $2 billion decision. Right. And you can, so anyway, all right. That is non-firm imports. This was a relatively non-controversial issue, at least amongst regional state committee and cost allocation working group. This is somewhat of a timing issue and a quirk of timing, in that, we talked about this a lot last quarter, that the SPP board approved and the RSC approved a new demand response policy and a peak demand assessment, which basically says to a load serving entity, okay, you're going to be held to account for whatever your projected peak load was. And it's going to be weather normalized, and there's going to be tolerances, a 3% tolerance band. But ultimately, if you dramatically under forecast what your load is, and you end up being short relative to your accredited capacity, you're going to be held to account for that. You're going to have to pay a deficiency payment. The vote here was to sort of confirm that that new policy will also apply to the West. And then there was a relatively minor, like a ministerial, a number error that needed to be revised in the tariff. You can see the Markets and Operations Policy Committee only voted with 44% support. 44% support. I mean, the load serving entities in the region continue to not be fans of the peak demand assessment portion of this policy. And I think that pretty much is reflected in the vote totals. The FERC Order 1920 compliance filing, this is, you know, aptly named. I mean, this was a required compliance filing out of FERC Order 1920. SPP was already largely compliant with a lot of the concepts from the FERC Order 1920. A few things that needed to change was they needed to be able to, they had to have the ability to issue notices to construct for a 20-year planning study. There were a few additional benefit metrics that had to be revised. There had to be, I think there's one additional future that had to be evaluated. Ultimately, as you can see, that this was not a controversial issue relative to, I mean, this specific revision request and the way, the fashion in which SPP is choosing to comply with FERC Order 1920, which is basically the consolidated planning process. You know, almost 100% approval in all of the working groups. The one no vote has been Texas all the way through, and it's because Texas is involved in litigation with the federal government over FERC Order 1920. And so every time that anything comes up with 1920 associated with it, they vote no, and they explain that, you know, their vote is necessary just to maintain consistency with their existing ongoing litigation. The next one was interesting, a little more controversial. This was an element of SPP's 1920, FERC Order 1920 compliance filing. So this is a public policy cost allocation, which basically says, all right, when we do these 20-year planning studies, when SPP does the 20-year planning study, they are going to run all of the modeling as in a status quo type, you know, everybody's best guess of what the world's going to look like 20 years from now. And then they're going to do another model run that attempts to, I don't know, siphon off or isolate the impacts of individual states within the region that have a public policy that may be driving transmission investment. And so there's not a lot of certainty right now as to what that actual public policy might be. And SPP always points out we've never built a transmission project that was driven by a state's public policy directives. But if I think, you know, the obvious public policies that people are pointing to in support of their vote on this situation are instances in which a state has a 100% zero carbon-free energy policy by a certain time frame. And I think this is a little bit of a sort of a warning or a check to make sure that, look, if Minnesota or New Mexico, just purely hypothetically, as the only two states in the region that have 100% carbon-free energy policy today, and they both both voted no in response to this vote. But if one of those two states has a public policy that says 100% zero carbon-free energy policy, and as a result of that, they are setting certain resources. You know, I think the idea is disparate, far away, you know, resources that are far away from load, and that's going to drive additional transmission. then the incremental costs associated with that transmission will be cost allocated to the states that drove that public policy. That this is, you know, in one of the follow-on orders to 1920, I think it was 1920A and or 1920B, the FERC specifically mentioned that this was a possibility as long as it was approved ahead of time, and you know it was and then ultimately any resulting change in the cost allocation is going to have to go back before FERC. And so this is one of those votes that, I mean, it got a pretty high degree of majority, but not 100% consensus. But it was pretty important for some of the commissioners in the SPP region. And I think it does sort of send the right signals to ensure that if an individual state within SPP sets, you know, dramatic public policy that's going to potentially harm the other states, and I think this establishes that that sort of backstop or harm avoidance policy. Anything else you'd like to add to that one, Chair?
No, I mean, I guess there is the other side to the debate, which is just, and I think it's a fair point. You know, some of these states might say, you know, look, we have, potentially we could have policies that drive investment, but you know, what you should really do is you should, you know, once those lines are planned, we should just do an honest to goodness look at, you know, who is getting the benefits of those lines, and you know, then let's allocate the costs. And I think that's a fair point, because that, you know, there's nothing to say that just because it's planned for this reason doesn't mean that Kansas or some other state wouldn't benefit. You know, I guess the way I looked at it is this is kind of a backstop. It's a line in the sand that says at least the default rule is going to be that if your policy is driving the planning and construction of a facility, at least as a default, you know, your customers are going to pay for it. I think we've left enough room in it that if a public policy line ever is planned, which I think is, I don't know, I guess I won't pontificate on whether it's likely or unlikely, but if it ever does actually happen, I think there's room in there to look at the benefits and for us to have a conversation about whether, you know, if it would be unreasonable, you know, for any of the other states to not pay any part of it. You know, if there were overwhelming benefits going to some other states, I think we could still consider that and have a conversation about it. It's just an indication of where we all are right now, that, you know, there is some concern that we have states with policies that could drive things that are different than what the rest of the region is driving. And we just want to make sure if your policy is the only thing driving those, that your customers will pay for it. But I think there's room, you know, as we look at individual projects, I think there's room to look at something that maybe started out as a public policy project and actually do the math, look at the benefits, and then we can have a conversation about whether the allocation should be any different. But, you know, right now, the default rule is going to, if FERC approves it, you know, the default rule would be that the state with the public policy driving the project, that their customers are going to pay for it. So there is a reasonable debate there, though.
No, that's good color. Appreciate the addition. The other thing is there's a lot of discussion about, look, our state may drive transmission investment associated with, you know, doubling the level of renewable energy that is serving our state, as an example, but that there will be fuel savings associated with that. There will be, you know, there will be wholesale market impacts and potential wholesale market savings associated with that. And so I think everybody recognized that ultimately, yes, there's going to have to be a full evaluation of the costs and the benefits associated with additional transmission. But if ultimately that is being disparately received, then this is out there, right? Okay, that completes all of the RSC business meeting items. Next, we'll talk about the items that were voted on by the SPP Board of Directors. First of all the previously discussed RSC voting items were approved by the board. There were 2 competitive upgrades, transmission lines that were, that the selection of the designated transmission owner was made during this meeting. We'll talk about those. One of those competitive upgrades, interestingly, only had 1 bidder. So it's still a competitive upgrade, because that's the tariff definition of it, but there was only 1 bidder. And we'll just talk about, these are all of the substantive issues that were approved by the SPP board. The first one was the first competitive upgrade is the one that I mentioned that only had 1 competitive bidder. It was the New Underwood to Laramie River project. As a reminder, all of these transmission lines are, the naming convention is, which 2 substations they are connecting. It's not an indication of, direction of flow of electrons or anything else. It's just, there's two substations we're connecting. That's the Laramie River substation here in southeast Wyoming, and the New Underwood substation in western South Dakota. This project was always only to go from the Laramie River substation to the state line in Nebraska. Nebraska is a right of first refusal state, and so ultimately the competitive portion of the line was always going to be just that portion that enters Nebraska. Originally, it planned to be an 83.8 mile 345 kV line, sort of going in a straight line direction up here to the north and east. Ultimately, what ended up occurring after the original project was approved, my understanding is that there were discussions with potential bidders to the RFP, and it ultimately it was determined that there could be a different route that would go more straight to the Nebraska border instead of northeasterly, more diagonal. This was a question of coming straight to the Nebraska border. So it was a shorter line, a 43-mile line that ended up being bid. And you can see that there was 1 bidder. The bidder isn't identified here, but it was Basin Electric Cooperative. Ultimately, here's the specifics of it. They had a cap of the project's ROE at 11% for the first 5 years, which is pretty high. I think it's especially high when we talk about the winning bidder that we'll talk about for the next transmission line. And capping the equity portion of the project at 50% for the first 5 years. This is the designated transmission owner that was recommended to build this line because they were the only bidder. The next project that came up for competitive bid, there were 2 bidders on this transmission line. The first was a development arm of ITC, ITC Development Corp. And they ultimately were selected as the bidder, as the successful bidder. The other bidder was like a consortium or a joint venture of NextEra and Ameren. So a couple things on this line. This is a line that will come before the KCC for siting at some point. It's one of the 2 transmission lines that were identified in the 2024 ITP for winter weather, for the Winter Storm Uri storm in particular. The other transmission line that will go unnamed, associated with Winter Storm Elliott, is currently before the commission in a siting proceeding. This was the only line that was identified out of those three that affected Kansas for winter weather related resiliency planning. This is the only one that was chosen to be a competitive upgrade based on the need date and the anticipated need date that was showing up in the SPP models. So this is an 85-mile line from Elm Creek substation to the Tobias substation in Nebraska. But as a reminder, again, because Nebraska has right of first refusal, this and so they do not allow competitive bidding in Nebraska. This project only covers the portion of the line from Elm Creek substation to the Kansas-Nebraska border, which is about 42 miles. The original study cost estimate for that 42 miles was $147 million. Ultimately, and you'll see, keep that number in mind, $147 million. This is sort of a high-level summary of the entities that bid on the project. You know, I think the independent expert panel said, look, both respondents were highly qualified. Either entity could have built this project. Ultimately, what won the day was ultimately the projected cost of the project, as well as the robustness of the cost caps and the total revenue requirement cap over the first 20 years of the project. And so this, as a reminder, these are the categories that are included within SPP's FERC Order 1000 competitive transmission owner selection process. These are the maximum points that can be awarded for each category, and this is ultimately what the independent expert panel awarded for each of these categories. Now, interestingly, remember that the total estimated cost of the competitive upgrade was $147 million, $148 million. The estimated, the anticipated bid to build this project, the construction costs for proposal A, as you can see, it was a little under $31 million. Proposal B's estimate was about $65 million. Now, it was an interesting discussion at the board meeting, because I don't know how else to put it other than there was an incredible amount of skepticism displayed by both the independent expert panel as well as the board of directors that ultimately ended up approving proposal A. That there was a discussion like, to build a 42-mile 345 kV project for less than $1 million a mile, like there was no other example of where that had been done within SPP. And so ultimately what the independent expert panel chose to do is they chose to score in the rate analysis section. They scored proposal A based on the cost cap of $45 million and not the actual projected construction cost. It just, again, as a, I don't know, maybe as a conservative assumption, saying, look, that's so low, we don't know how they can possibly build it for that. But let's use the cost cap amount, the contractually guaranteed maximum that they're going to seek to recover from customers, with of course the standard exceptions that occur for force majeure and for other outside externalities that are outside of the control of the entity building the transmission line. But in any case, there's a $45 million cost cap. And so ultimately that's proposal A is what was selected by the board and by the independent expert panel. Here are some additional details that went into I guess that were summarized by the independent expert panel, and ultimately the board used to make the decision. So again, $45 million construction cost cap. There's a 20-year annual. There's an annual cap on the annual transmission revenue requirement for 20 years that is based on that $45 million, as well as operating and maintenance expenses. And this one is really, really, really interesting. There was a 20-year weighted cost of equity cap of 4.05%. So if you do some math, I mean, a 60% equity ratio, which ITC has today, that's a very low cost of equity. I mean, that or return on equity, like lower than 8%. At a 50% equity ratio, which is oftentimes used as, sort of this back of the envelope estimate of a reasonable capital structure, right? 50-50 equity and debt. At a 50% capital structure, that is an 8.1% return on equity. So it's interesting. I mean, it's very low. And it'd be a 10.10% return on equity at a 40% capital structure equity, which 40% is almost universally viewed as like the lowest possible equity level that a investor-owned utility would capitalize itself with. So it's interesting. Yeah. So ITC Development Corp, they were the winners of this project. We will see, the KCC will see a certificate filing at some point, requesting to certificate as in the public interest of the state of Kansas, the entity ITC Development Corp to build this project. And then also ultimately this project will come before the KCC in a line citing proceeding. That's all I had on that. The next bullet point is the board approved SPP's strategic plan, 5-year strategic plan, or I guess it's a 4-year plan. That should be an active link. It looks like it is. You can click that and on the version that I sent you and go out and pull down SPP's strategic plan. I'm not going to read, this plan to you, and I'm not going to try to read this slide as well. I mean, this is sort of the one slide summarization of the SPP strategic plan. And honestly, I feel like it was very heavily supported by the stakeholder community and each of the working groups. And honestly, I didn't really view it as, it's pretty much business as usual as far as I'm concerned.
You want me to tell
Justin?
everybody the one comment I made
Sure,
in the
go
board
ahead.
meeting? I agree. It's pretty business as usual and, pretty standard, but, there's some ambitious pieces. The one thing I did stand up at the board meeting, because I wanted the board to hear this, there is a lot of focus, and it's in that top level. I think it's the middle point. It's pretty small on my screen, but they made a point of emphasis to say, look, we've got the lowest wholesale cost of electricity in the nation out of all the regions, and it's one of our strategic goals to make sure that stays that way. We want to maintain the lowest wholesale electricity costs in America. And, I stood up and I said, that's good. It's something to be proud of. But I said, I would just caution you to not put too much emphasis on that piece, because there can be an inverse relationship between wholesale electricity costs and retail electricity costs. You could spend all the money in the world building the most beautiful transmission system that moves power all around the region, and you could always access the lowest generators. But that transmission also costs money, and that flows into retail bills. And so you might have the lowest wholesale market energy costs, But if you've built a bunch of infrastructure to make that happen, you could end up having higher retail costs. And so, I just caution them that I think it's a worthy goal, to make sure that we keep wholesale costs low, but I want them to be interfacing with state regulators and the load serving entities to make sure that we've got the right balance, of investment at the wholesale level. Because really, as a state regulator, what we care about is the lowest delivered cost of energy to retail customers. And so, that point was well taken in the board meeting. It sounded like there has been a lot of discussions along those lines in meetings that I haven't been in. But I thought it was an important thing to impress upon them, because I've certainly seen SPP leadership, boast about that point on a number of occasions. And I agree, again, it is something to be proud of, but I don't think I don't want them to be singularly focused on that point, because you can go too far. So that I did want to make that point in the board meeting, and I did. So that was the only comment I had on the strategic plan. Looks like Commissioner Keen's got off mute though, so I will turn it to him.
Yes, thank you, Chair French. I appreciate your observation. Justin, I'm trying to play chess on two levels with both your presentation, and I'm here at the IOGCC annual meeting in Oklahoma City. I'm trying to focus more on yours right now. But if we can go back to the two previous slides, the one had to deal with Laramie. That 345 kV project, and the one subsequent to that, what was it? What was that called?
Yeah, so there's the Elm Creek to Tobias 345 kV.
Yeah, but both of these.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding it, basically, the latter one, the Elm Creek, that's a non-competitive bid situation in Kansas because it fits within the exceptions to the Order 1000 as an emergency. Is that right?
No, it was competitively bid in Kansas, because it does not fit within the exceptions of the FERC Order 1000. So
Okay.
It will not be competitively bid in Nebraska because Nebraska has a right of first refusal.
Yeah, I got that part loud and clear. So if I go back to the Laramie example then and try to contrast these two, in a nutshell, provide me with that analogous overview for Laramie. I know that there's a ROFR issue in Nebraska. What about the Kansas part of that one?
So this one will not impact Kansas. This one goes from Laramie River substation in southeast Wyoming,
Okay.
and ultimately it terminates in western South Dakota, at the new Underwood substation.
Okay.
Ultimately though, the RFP was for a kind of a more direct route to get into Nebraska. And then the Nebraska portion of it will not be competitively bid.
Okay. So am I correct that in both of these instances, Kansas ratepayers will bear approximately 16 to 17% of the total cost? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I want you to opine just a little bit for me, to the extent you feel comfortable. Let's use the Elm Creek to Tobias example, because there's a case where we have competitively bid on one side of a state line and a ROFR circumstance on the north side in Nebraska. So basically, you have this dichotomy here: a competitively bid situation on half the line, non-competitively bid on the other half. Yet Kansas ratepayers are going to bear basically the same share of the total cost, notwithstanding that fact. But doesn't that disadvantage Kansas ratepayers a bit because of the presence of the ROFR overlay in roughly half the line?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's a quandary, right? I mean, I mean, on the one hand, if this level of cost savings can actually be achieved, and the cost caps hold, and there aren't the laundry list, if you want to call it that, the list of exceptions and anything that's outside of the utility's control, right? If the cost caps hold, then that is going to benefit all SPP ratepayers equally. Kansas ratepayers at 16.5% of those costs, and 16.5%. It will also benefit ratepayers in Nebraska and South Dakota who will pay their smaller allocated share of the total costs. So it's difficult because I'm not as familiar with South Dakota's ROFR law, but I was just thinking, this portion of the transmission line in South Dakota, it was not part of the bid either. I think South Dakota has a ROFR as well. So it's just such a hodgepodge mix throughout SPP.
Right.
But we do not have a ROFR in Kansas. We still have competitively bid a process for competitive transmission projects in Kansas that don't fall under one of the exceptions that federal government allows, right? So it's difficult, but it sort of highlights it in this case because you have a cross-border project.
Exactly.
But any transmission that's built in North Dakota or South Dakota or Nebraska or I can't remember the status of Iowa's ROFR law right now. It's definitely the case that some states allow competition, some states do not allow competition, and the reality is we pay an allocated portion of sort of all of those transmission projects.
I get that. I mean, I was actually, and I appreciate your wrestling with the real issue I was presenting to you, which is the dichotomy between those states that have ROFR and those that don't. That was really the wrestling match I wanted to see you do, and I think you've done so well. I'll leave it at that. Chair French, did you have something you wanted to interject?
Oh, I just was going to ask Justin. Justin, I missed a good part of this presentation for another meeting. I think we had a business meeting at the same time as this. So I was up in my room on our business meeting. Did they say who was building the portion of the line in Nebraska? Is that NPPD?
I think that's right.
Okay.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I mean, and so in Nebraska, they're all obviously public power, but it will still be, I mean, I assume we can still look at their ATRR, and so it might be interesting to compare, cost of those two segments. So that a little bit apples and oranges because one's a public power, but still gives a good indication. So that might be something we look at as those projects move forward.
Yeah, and it's not, my understanding is Nebraska doesn't actually have a right of first refusal law. I think it just says you can't build anything pertaining to electric energy unless you are a municipal operating in our state, right? So it's pretty much the same thing. The other thing that's interesting too is, you think about, the reason I highlighted as much as I did the return on equity and the capital structure issues is, the first project, that Laramie River project, was a competitively bid project, but a cooperative was the only bidder. Right? This is a not-for-profit entity that, right? They were the only bidder, and their cap was an 11% cost of equity and a 50% equity threshold. So it's I mean, we have this is kind of perfect timing, right? Because as everybody knows, there's a complaint pending before FERC right now by a lot of load serving entities within the SPP and MISO that says the competitive transmission development process is slowing down our ability to build transmission. It's unjust and unreasonable. But there's a lot of arguments on both sides of that. And this is an example where you have two new competitively bid projects. One will be the poster child for people that are very pro competition to say, look at this, it's going to only cost 30% of what everybody thought it was going to. And then on the other hand, the other project is, there was only one bidder, and it's not a very robust set of cost protections in that instance, right? An 11% return on equity cap, there's no entity that earns 11% return on equity anywhere in Kansas. So anyway, I don't know.
Justin, I don't know if, I mean, maybe you don't want to say anything about it, but I do think that's one of those examples where, I don't know if it's Basin, right?
It is. Yeah.
And so they're a cooperative, and people would say a cooperative doesn't have a profit incentive, but I think this may be one of those cases where they could potentially have a revenue incentive that, it does provide more revenue to go back to their members and to offset, all their other costs of business. And so, I don't know anything about Basin. I'm not saying anything, untoward about them or their practices, but they don't necessarily in this case have an incentive to keep that number maybe as low as they otherwise would have. Justin, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, but I mean, that's just an observation I had.
No, it's true. I mean, it's true. And if you think about an 11% return on equity and a 50% equity cap, I mean, that would be a weighted cost of equity of 5.5%. It's a lot higher than 4.05%, right? So,
Justin, if we can go back, I don't mean to overly dwell on this, but go back to the Elm Creek Tobias example once again. On the Kansas side, we had a competitively bid line. To the extent this is not a Fifth Amendment question, or you can answer it, what was the difference? Do you know what the difference was between the winner and the runner-up?
yeah, it's right here. So the ITC Development Corp, their estimated engineering and construction costs, so the estimated cost to build the line is let's just say it's called $31 million, $30.8 million.
Right.
And the runner-up was $65.3 million, right? Those numbers were heavily discussed at the board meeting because it's fascinating. 65 million is more than half. I mean, it's less than half of what the study cost estimate was. And proposal A, ITC's estimate, was again less than half of what proposal B was. And the independent expert panel, that's interesting. There's a lot of discussion about it because they're going, well, we can't find an example of anybody that's ever built 345 kV transmission for less than $1 million a mile. So it was almost like they were saying, yeah, I know they're estimating they're going to do it for 30 million, and they literally did the scoring. I think that they had so much skepticism about that cost estimate that they did the scoring based on kind of the worst case scenario of 45 million. If the cost cap that ITC is saying they will be held to, basically. So anyway, it is an interesting situation. A lot of head scratching. A lot of board members specifically spoke up and asked questions about this. Like, how could this possibly be? And I don't have
just for clarification, because there was confusion on this point in the meeting. That 148 million cost estimate, you did confirm with SPP staff that is just for the Kansas portion, which is directly relatable to these 30.9 and 65.3 numbers, right?
I did, because we had an indication from another Kansas stakeholder that was not accurate, that the 148 million was for the entire 85 miles, not just the 42 miles. But so we went back and confirmed with SPP General Counsel, and they said, nope, that's not accurate. The 148 million was for the 42 miles of transmission. And I actually think that that kind of makes sense in terms of, if you think about millions of dollars per mile for 345 kV, I mean, 148 million divided by 42 miles is like 3.5 million a mile. And this project here, right, this original cost estimate was 247 million divided by 84 miles, which is $3 million a mile, right? So I think it's, yeah.
Well, listen, I appreciate, am I interrupting you, Justin?
No, sir, no.
Yeah, I appreciate so much this colloquy. I think it's very interesting. All of the granularity that we've talked about and the back and forth here, I think is very helpful. I'll only add one rhetorical statement that maybe is the segue out of here. As a devotee conceptually and philosophically to competitive bidding, all I can say is the numbers for me, res ipsa loquitur. They speak for themselves. Thank you for your indulgence.
Yeah, sure thing. Interesting timing for sure with these two projects being approved during the pending complaint. And more importantly, I thought you were going to ask me questions about SPP's strategic plan, and I did not want to answer those. So I'm glad that we went into the discussion about the competitive bidding.
This meeting isn't over yet.
I know. Okay. So RR 747 was interesting. It's about economic topology optimization. Basically, all that means is that there can be instances where you can reconfigure the physical configuration of the transmission system that will lower wholesale electricity costs, but continue to reliably serve customers. And it's interesting. I mean, it sounds kind of wonky and not important, but there are instances where this can result in hundreds of millions of dollars of savings for customers. So this was a big deal. There was a lot of consternation by transmission owning entities. A lot of especially the more sophisticated transmission owning entities are already trying to do this to benefit their customers, but I think there was some reticence to being basically told to do it by a regional entity, especially when those transmission owners are closest to the reliability, the consequences that can occur when reliability issues do occur. And so I think ultimately the consensus was that this was a good process that was developed. There's basically two levels of review that occurs independently, and you see I got the flow chart established down here where basically SPP does a reliability assessment to make sure that the transmission system can be reconfigured in this fashion, and then the transmission owner does the reliability assessment. And it's only if both parties agree ultimately that the system will be reconfigured. Okay. This was interesting. This is definitely a Kansas issue. One of the decisions that the board had to make at this board meeting was whether about $300 million worth of transmission upgrades that are likely to be driven by, or that will be driven by two anticipated data centers in the DeSoto, Kansas area. Sort of code named the Pilot and the Astra North data centers. And so each one of these is 600 megawatts. Each one is slated to be served by Evergy Kansas Central and will be served under energy service agreements that fall under the commission's large load power service tariff. which I know the commissioners are familiar with. So just as a reminder for what attachment AQ is, this is essentially anytime you are making a load serving entity like Evergy is making a delivery point addition, a delivery point deletion, or a delivery point modification, that has to be studied through SPP to ensure that it's not going to break the transmission system, right? There's not going to be some sort of voltage or thermal overload situation that stability issue or short circuit issue that is causing problems on the transmission system. Evergy sought to have both of these customers, both of these projects studied through attachment AQ. And ultimately what SPP identified was 6 transmission projects costing or anticipated to cost $314 million to serve these 2 customers. And there are also, 13 other facility level projects, which will be paid for entirely by these customers themselves, totaling $352 million. So this is, again, we had a lot of discussion about this during the large load power service hearing, but the way that this is structured in our tariff and the way that generally the cost allocation and the assignment of costs works throughout the SPP region is that if there are infrastructure upgrades that are necessary specifically to serve these customers, then those projects are cost allocated directly to those customers. If there are network upgrades that are necessary to bolster the transmission system generally in the area where this additional load is occurring, but those network upgrades are going to benefit other customers, they're going to, have additional follow-on reliability or resiliency benefits, then those costs are cost allocated generally according to existing cost allocation rules. So under existing cost allocation rules, under highway byway, this $314 million of transmission will be cost allocated across the entire region. And it's interesting because you think about the $314 million of transmission, that sounds like a lot, and it is. But if you were to convert that into a revenue requirement basis, right, and say, well, you can get real close when you do that, assuming a 10%. If you invest $300 million of transmission, that'll increase the revenue requirement about $30 million a year, okay? And that's just because of that's weighted average cost of capital, pre-tax weighted average cost of capital, and then maybe 2 or 3% depreciation rate to depreciate this stuff out over 30 or 40 years, and you're going to come up with about a 10% impact in terms of rate base to revenue requirement impact. So if you think about that, if these transmission investments were to be 100% directly assigned to Evergy, which is not the cost allocation that they're supposed to be assigned, but if they were, then that would increase, I did this math last night, that would increase Evergy's transmission delivery charge revenue requirement by about 7%, okay? On the other hand, the load that these customers are going to bring to the system, if you assume an 80% load factor, these customers would increase Evergy Kansas Central's denominator, the billing units that are used to calculate the transmission rates, by about 20%, right? So even if these projects would be directly assigned to Evergy Kansas Central customers, the math that I have done suggests that serving these customers will lower Evergy's transmission costs significantly. I mean, more than 10% on a rate basis, right? But this is the sort of thing, this is a real world example of the debate that is playing out about how data center customers should pay for their infrastructure. Should 100% of these costs be identified to those customers? and maybe that's all they pay. But this is a real world example where if that was the case, if these two data center customers were to be required to pay $314 million in addition to the $352 million that they're paying, and then they were allowed to not have to pay for the cost of all of the transmission that was built before they ever came to the system, that would actually end up harming retail customers because transmission rates wouldn't go down, right? So it's an interesting issue. The question here before the board was whether or not these transmission projects fit the definition of short-term reliability projects and whether or not they should be built by the incumbent utility or whether they should be subject to competition. Ultimately, the board made the decision that they did fit the definition of short-term reliability projects, which is allowed for under FERC Order 1000 and the competitive process that FERC allows. And so these projects will be, and they were awarded to Evergy Kansas Central. Now, whether or not these projects will ultimately end up in a line siding proceeding before the KCC is, I think, still up in the air. Still a question of whether or not Evergy will be able to use existing right-of-way and double circuit some of these facilities, or ultimately whether there will be new greenfield transmission projects that are large enough that they require a line siding proceeding before the KCC. That's all I have to say about those projects. The next issue was, again, relatively non-controversial. RR642 is a load hosting capacity tool. This is something that is currently being rolled out. It's going to be filed at FERC in this quarter, and then ultimately will be expected to go live in the third or fourth quarter of 2026. This is essentially what you can think of as a heat map. It's the desire is to publish information pertaining to the existing transmission system and where there are areas of that could support additional resources or support additional load, and to make that information publicly available and to make it easier for entities with less resources, basically, that wouldn't otherwise have access to this information. And then this last one is interesting. So Anthem to Seminole, or Seminum to Anthem, it's Seminole to Anthem. If you recall, this is one of the 765 kV projects that was approved earlier this year / late last year at the board of directors meeting in November, SPP board meeting in November. This was the project that wasn't technically a reliability project yet, but it was about to flip to be a reliability project because of the updated load, the updated information that SPP engineering staff was aware of. And ultimately, it was approved as a notice to construct item that ultimately the board approved. Well, this SPP engineering staff, after having approved the notice to construct, they were continuing to evaluate the termination point at Anthem. And I think there has been some additional load that they did not anticipate that has arisen at the Guava substation. It's still in Oklahoma. It's still the same transmission owners of the substation. But ultimately, a question arose as to whether that termination point should be refined and would actually be optimized if that line terminated at a different substation versus the original one. And so that requires a formal board vote to reevaluate that. And ultimately, that's what came before the board, and it was approved. And you can see here some of the bullet points that supported the decision to reevaluate that termination point. And it's essentially much more firm signed load at a different delivery point in Oklahoma than was anticipated when the line was built or was issued the notice to construct. I think it is a good example, a good reminder that it's not like, once SPP issues these notice to construct, they wash their hands of it. They are continuing to do an evaluation until until the steel starts to be actually put in the ground. They will reevaluate these notices to construct and do the right thing, go back and study the termination points if the data is supporting that that's what should occur. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. We've got more time still until noon. I think I'm going to roll into some of these appendix presentations, or the slides that are in the appendix. I mentioned this before. I provided a few updates on the ITP, the 2026 ITP. It's a little bit quiet right now at SPP with regard to where this portfolio stands, and that's for a reason. It's because the engineers are cranking through the models and they're doing the heavy lifting and the analytical work, evaluating what the next portfolio should look like, what the degree to which the overlay is going to be, double circuit 345 kV lines, maybe 3 of them instead of something like a 765 kV line or a 500 kV double circuit line. There's a lot of, real intense engineering, evaluation, model building that's occurring. But I think everybody is sort of understands what's coming, at least at a high level. And so SPP is doing its best to keep stakeholders informed as to the process that they're going through and what the next steps are and what is coming. There's a couple of there's a slide in the next couple of slides that refers to the Get Informed Fridays process that SPP has went through. And I don't have links to the actual recordings of those slides or of those meetings in this presentation, but I have those and I can send them to the commissioners. I'll tell you, those are very, very informative meetings. They're about 2 to 3 hours, but it's literally SPP transmission planning engineers going through state by state by state through the region, what the drivers are at that point in the modeling of what they are seeing that is driving the need for an overlay, something larger than 345 kV overlay throughout the region. It is very, very informative to listen to the non-political, non-leadership level. I mean, the chair and I were joking during this meeting. I mean, this is the nerdy transmission planning engineer with the cat crawling on his desk, they're doing the transmission planning stuff. I mean, it gets down into the real nitty-gritty details, and it really helps people understand what the drivers are behind this transmission development. I've attended all of those Get Informed Fridays myself. They record, again, there's recordings of those. I will send those links to the commissioners as soon as we get off this call. I highly encourage you to take a look at those, because it's the kind of detail and it's the kind of information that's going to be necessary ultimately, that people are going to have to get educated throughout the 14th state region and understand that the kind of load growth that we're talking about, the generation that's necessary to serve that load, you can't serve the kind of load that people are talking about and put the new generation online that people are talking about without significant amounts of new transmission. And that's what comes through in these Get Informed Friday calls. And again, I'll send that to the commissioners. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the development of this process. And in May, they did not do the Get Informed Friday call in May in order to be able to, continue doing the development work and the engineering work that they're doing, but it's going to pick back up pretty soon. And I see that you're off mute, Commissioner Keene, and welcome your comments or questions here. I just want to just real quick provide this high level timeline. This is where we are in the process and what is coming. This engineering planning summit in Colorado on July 29th. I haven't made the decision yet about whether I'm going to travel out there in person or whether I'll do that virtually. But this will be the first instance in which anyone in the SPP region will have the full access to the full portfolio that SPP will be recommending for the 2026 ITP and for the overlay. And then ultimately you can see Markets and Operations Policy Committee and the Board of Directors meetings. These are obviously important meetings as well, and timelines in the process. And then this is that Get Informed Friday meeting cadence and schedule that I referred to. The one that I'm in particular am referring to that was really eye-opening and educational for me is this April meeting. If you only took the time to watch one of these, the one that is the study driver for the April Get Informed Friday was exceptionally educational about exactly what the drivers are that are, that SPP is pointing out is just requiring this much additional transmission to keep the lights on. So again, you can see there's other stuff coming. They're going to talk more specifically about 765 versus, say, double circuit 500 kV or maybe three 345 kV double circuit lines next to each other. It's not 765 kV is not the only option. You can do it with 345 kV double circuit lines as well. It's more expensive, takes up more land, but you can do it. So anyway, this is a good stopping point, I think, for any questions or comments. But I don't see Commissioner Keene coming back off. Oh, there he is. He's back.
Yeah, your luck ran out.
I'm glad to have you back.
Thank you very sincerely for this part of your overview. I think I may even speak for my colleagues here. I'd rather have the risk of too much information than less. So I would say thank you for sharing these calls with us. Thank you for providing the context about which ones you think are more consequential. But I would like to be in the loop here for you to continue to forward these things prospectively, because I think it's helpful. I mean, I'd rather be able to decide, well, I don't think I really want to go into that level of depth on that subject, rather than not have the option of deciding I wanted to hear it. So I'm really grateful to that. I do have two follow-on questions here, if I could. One, Justin, you gave a very excellent presentation by way of an overview for a CLE in Wichita about a month ago. And one part of that presentation, if you could refresh my recollection, I think it had to do with the SPP integration transmission plan going out to maybe 2028, and you indicated that that was potentially a fairly large number. Could you refresh my recollection on the context and the essence of what you were sharing then?
Excuse me. Yes. So, that is it's a preliminary number. It's a preliminary view, but it's informed based on the information that we have to date. And it's a view that I think it's the best information that we have at this point relative to what the 2026 ITP might look like, right? And so, you'll recall that there was trying to fresh and make sure some of these numbers are fresh in my recently ill mind. The 2025 ITP originally started off around a $20 billion portfolio, 18 to 19 billion, and what ultimately had notices to construct issued was around 8.6 billion, I think, right? But the remaining portion of that was deferred for further evaluation, optimization, and evaluation of the entire overlay, the entire potentially 765 kV overlay in the 2026 ITP. And I think what we're being told at this point is that the level of new load growth that is coming online in the region, the amount of additional generation that needs to be connected to serve that load, we're being told 345 kV transmission lines are not going to cut it. It is going to be a series of double circuit 345s, or maybe double circuit 500 kV, or I think more likely 765 kV. And the preliminary overlay that has been presented and evaluated, the math that I did in a care team meeting once, sort of, high level back of the envelope math, I guess it's a $50 to $60 billion transmission portfolio. Okay. Now, you will not find, I don't think you will find a official SPP endorsed estimate of what the potential for a 765 kV overlay portfolio would be, but I'm using basically their numbers to do that math, right? They just don't want to front run a number like that before they actually have developed the portfolio. But based on the information we have today, a $50 to $60 billion portfolio is not outside of the realm of possibility. It's not like anybody laughs when I throw those numbers out, or, that's probably pretty realistic. Now, the thing to remember with that is that just like last year's portfolio, they're not going to issue $50 or $60 billion of notices to construct. They're going to say, if all of the load that is currently projected for our region comes to fruition over the next 10 years, and all of the generators that people want to connect to our system actually occurs over the next 10 years, this is the amount of transmission we have to build to keep the lights on. But there's going to be a staging. So remember that it's 10 years worth of potential transmission projects. But I know that there will be staging. It will be, here's this first tranche we need within the next 4 or 5 years. And then that'll be reevaluated every year. But that's the numbers that people are, I guess myself, is tossing around. But it's, again, there is a lot that is still up in the air, and it's all based on engineering and analytics and modeling, and that's why that's why I think it's so important that people do their best to get informed and educated about what actually drives these transmission projects. through that Get Informed Friday series. Get Informed Friday, yeah, but yeah, it's a potentially large portfolio, but we will know those details. I mean, the timeline I was talking about, everything I'm talking about, we will know it this year.
And Justin, if you go back to that last slide, I think that had the transmission summit on it, which is at the very end of July. And there you go, July 29th. My understanding is that is sort of the first time that they will roll out an idea of what that portfolio looks like. It might be a little rough, but I think that is the first kind of official time where you may see,
Right.
a portfolio with high level dollar figures on it.
Yeah. And I'm still considering whether I'm going to go there in person. I mean, I'm sort of double booked that day with another, the supply adequacy working group meets during that period of time as well. So I may do that virtually, but everything will kick off very intensely after that time, that 7/29. And again, SPP is being very quiet right now, but it's not because they're hiding anything. The models that they are running to make the determination of which transmission projects they're saying they want to build, it literally takes days to crank through this model, right? So it's real engineering work that's being done right now. And you'll see there ended up being a 15-day extension on this detailed project proposal window because they had to make some modeling revisions. And that 15 days, to give you an example, the time frame is so tight between here. That 15-day extension early in this process ended up pushing out the board of directors meeting in November from November 4th to November 17th. So literally every day within this time frame is important for the engineers that are making these recommendations.
Well, Justin, I appreciate very much your sharing that overview. I also appreciate the qualifications that you've attached to that overview. But it's still a stunning number to me. It's so stunning. So I think we'll just have to take this thing a step at a time as we see this evolve, but I appreciate your sharing that very much. I had one other question by way of overview with the indulgence of you and my colleagues. And it goes back to an old issue. And I don't mean to be in any way repetitive of what you've said here today, but I think if you could kind of bring us up to date as best you can assess on cost allocation. I think there was some indication early on in the year that this might be the year for a reconsideration of how cost allocation methodology is going to work out, whether it be regionalized or if there be some mechanism other than just the universal sharing of a lot of costs across the entire 14-state region. Can you give us some kind of update on where that process is now in terms of a reevaluation, if it's out there?
Yep, I will. That's a good segue for the next subject and the last subject that I wanted to cover today. Just real quick before I get there, though, because I have slides that talk about the CARE team and cost allocation and the potential for revisions there. These are the sensitivities that SPP staff is telling us that they are going to run alongside the modeling that shows the need for this transmission and the need for the regional overlay, right? So they're saying, look, they obviously know this is a generational level of investment, and they need buy-in or support from customers, from legislators, from commissioners throughout the region. If it's going to work, it's going to have to be highly supported. And so, what they're going to do is they're going to run more sensitivities than they've ever ran before, right? They're going to say, look, what if we have very low renewable penetration going forward, we have no production tax credits, and we have very high gas prices, let's run that scenario. Does this transmission portfolio, do we still need it or not? There's, and you can see, and you can read the specific sensitivities, but there are a lot. And then they're also going to say, okay, we need to evaluate this on the idea that, let's say the AI data center load growth is a flash in the pan, and the only thing we do is increase our load by 25 or 30% for stuff that has signed agreements, and then it doesn't grow. Load does not grow after that during the planning horizon. So those are the kind of, they're going to do, I think, very robust modeling and analysis that show everybody, this is the solution. This is just what we're telling you is necessary to keep the lights on. So more to come on that. And then this is the contingent facilities slide that I was referring to before. And I think this is SPP saying, look, several of the 765 kV facilities we've already approved have generators out there that the region is going to plan on to keep the lights on, that have recognized that these facilities are contingent facilities. And so they're saying, I think what they're going to do is provide much more granularity and detail of, which specific transmission lines are absolutely necessary in order to bring online the 18,000 megawatts of generation that's sitting out there that wants to connect today. And so what this is a list from the existing, everything before this portfolio. This is, they're saying, look, today there are 81 generators totaling 18,700 megawatts, for which there are transmission lines we have planned and issued notices to construct, but are not yet in service. There's 18.7 gigawatts of generation out there that is waiting on these transmission facilities to be built before they can interconnect. And I just think this is an element of transmission planning that people don't spend enough time thinking about. I think unfortunately, we sort of pigeonhole ourselves into this thought of, well, let's just build generation. We don't need transmission. Let's build generation. Let's build more generation closer to load. But I think the problem is what transmission planning and generation planning engineers will tell you is transmission is like you got to have something to connect the generation to. In this instance, it's a contingent facility. Literally, you can't run the generator full out until you have that transmission line. And I think what they're saying is there's going to be a lot more of this coming in the future, and they're going to point out that. Okay, Engineering Planning Summit. This is, again, okay. Now we're at the CARE team. So the other thing that, just as a reminder, the CARE team, the focus of the cost control and cost allocation review and evaluation team is focused on cost allocation of above 345 kV facilities, as well as any appurtenant facilities that are absolutely necessary from an engineering perspective in order to build something above 345 kV for an overlay, for instance. And so this is a slide that was presented by Casey Cathy, the Vice President of Engineering at SPP, in terms of part of his engineering team's work is very much supporting the CARE team. And that's because several of the CARE team members, myself included, have said, I'm not comfortable making permanent, recommendations for cost allocation on the overlay, on the probably 765 kV overlay, unless we have updated, improved, accurate beneficiary pays, cost allocation, cost and benefit allocation estimates for how the overlay, for the entire overlay, and how it it stands to benefit different states and different utilities within those states throughout the region. And so this is SPP confirming that, look, our plan is we are going to support the care team's evaluation. We're going to quantify total cost and holistic benefits for the entire expanded extra high voltage overlay for the entire region. Here's an update in terms of where things stand right now. This is from the update that the care team provided to the board in May. So, this is sort of the 5 takeaways of what the care team has been able to reduce to writing and agree upon at this point. The cost of the overlay should be allocated such that the benefit cost ratio does not show disparate impacts between subregions. As a reminder, subregion is the way that today 100 to 300 kV facilities are allocated to a subregion today. They're not allocated to the states. So Kansas and Missouri share cost allocation today for anything greater than 100 kV, which is almost everything in the transmission world, right? But below 345 kV. They're saying, number 2, a high level principle that CARE has been able to essentially solidify around is that the overlay may be built in certain regions faster than others. It may benefit certain areas of the region faster than others, and whatever cost allocation methodology we arrive at needs to account for that, needs to take that into account. Number 3 is the large load issue, right? A very significant portion of this transmission is being driven by large loads, depending on how you define that, either large data centers or significant oil and gas electrification in certain areas in the Bakken and in the Permian areas of the footprint. And so ultimately, especially when it comes to data centers, care team is saying, look, we need to make sure that those people are paying their fair share. They're contributing to the cost of the infrastructure that they're building out or that they're driving the need for. Stranded asset cost protection is an important element of this as well. We need to make sure that if we're building a transmission system that's a generational investment that's going to last 60 or 80 years and benefit our country for that period of time, we need to make sure that the customers for whom we're building it for, if they're not going to be here, that they're going to pay their fair share of the costs necessary to build out that infrastructure. And then the 5th item is more the cost control element to the care team's evaluation, which is mostly about, look, if we build, and we will, because several states in the region have a right of first refusal, if we build some of this overlay without the benefits that come from an enhanced competitive process, then we want to make sure that entities are accountable for their cost estimates, for what happens if there are overruns, and that's the cost control element of the care team. So these 5 principles are really driving where the care team is at this point. Another important clarification that we were able to make, and this actually came in the April care team meeting in Louisiana, is that this is not only going to, the scope of potential changes for cost allocation changes is not only going to be limited to the overlay that comes out of the 2026 ITP, but the care team voted, I can't remember, but it was high level of consensus, in the 80+% range, I believe, that whatever cost allocation we come up with and recommended the RSC and to the board will cover the 2024, any above 345 kV facilities that came out of the 2024, 2025, and 2026 ITPs. So, the big 765 Potter to Crossroads to Phantom line that caused a lot of concern in our state and in other states. And also the sort of beginning portion of the 765 kV overlay that was approved in the 2025 ITP. All of that is going to be wrapped up and evaluated in this new potential cost allocation methodology. And look, these overlapping circles are sort of graphical representations of the type of conversation that we're having right now, where, you know, the idea of beneficiary pays is, you know, it has a lot of conceptual support. People say, well, look, you know, maybe we ought to be studying, you know, as precisely, as analytically as possible, how these transmission facilities are actually benefiting customers throughout the region, whether it be power flow modeling or adjusted production costs, which is basically fuel savings, economic benefits. And, you know, there's a lot of robust discussion about that. And it's because it's not easy, because the problem is the way that different states and different utilities use the transmission system in SPP, it changes literally every hour. It changes every 5 minutes. It changes at the speed of light. If you have a new delivery point addition, if you drop an old customer, if you add a new generator, it all changes all the time in terms of the reliability benefits of transmission. When it comes to estimating adjusted production costs and economic benefits, you know, you can calculate precisely if you know what the future is going to look like, if you know exactly what natural gas prices are going to be, you know exactly what federal energy policy is going to be, which changes dramatically every 4 years. If you know exactly which generators and which load is going to be online at each of the 17 states in the region, then you can calculate how each state and each utility is benefiting from transmission. But the reality is that too changes all the time. And so there is definitely a, and I promise I'm getting close to the end here. There is definitely a desire amongst, I would say, a significant majority of the CARE team to at least understand the degree to which either reliability, power flow modeling, or economic assessments to at least to see the snapshot view of the entire overlay at one time and evaluate generally how is this benefiting each of the states within the region. I think right now the majority opinion, the most likely, you know, handicapped estimate that people would put money on would be that kind of modeling is going to be done in order to determine the split between region-wide cost allocation and sub-regional cost allocation. So in other words, you know, like today, transmission between 100 and 300 kV is cost allocated 2/3 to the region where the poles are, and then 1/3 to the entire region. And I think the desire amongst the CARE team is to use that modeling to determine that split, the split between what portion of the overlay is going to be cost allocated based on where the physical transmission is versus region-wide allocation. And once you determine, okay, so if we say maybe it's exactly the same. Well, let's just say it's 50% is going to be based on the location of the assets and 50% is going to be region-wide allocated. Well, then you still have to determine within the subregion of Missouri and Kansas, how are we going to cost allocate these transmission lines? Because that still is going to be billions of dollars of transmission. But one thing I can say is like 95% likely to come out of this process. And it's good to have this kind of, I think it's good to have this kind of certainty this early in the process. Is today, if the transmission line is allocated to the region, earlier, Commissioner Keen, you mentioned 16.5% to Kansas. Just so everybody's clear, the way that's determined today is that 16.5%, that represents Kansas's usage of the region-wide transmission system today. That's It's based on the 12 coincident peaks. It's an average of the 12 CP. It's how much on average does Kansas use the transmission system today? And we use it on average today 16.5% of the time. But it is very likely that that is going to shift, for the overlay anyway, to a mixture between demand, 12 CP demand, and annual energy usage. How much energy does Kansas pull down off of the transmission grid on an 8760 basis, right? Every hour of the year. And there is a strong degree of consensus, like approaching 85 to 90% on the CARE team, that whatever cost allocation comes out of this process, for the portion of the lines that are regionally allocated, that is likely to be a mix between demand and energy. The reason for that, and the reason I think there's so much support for that, is because these large load customers are as energy intensive as they are. They have such high load factors, and I think people are attracted to this idea because they think it helps with cost causation, it helps with beneficiary pays, and it recognizes that we don't just build transmission for reliability purposes, which is what a demand allocator sort of links to, right? The idea of, if you're using, on average, Kansas is 16.5% of the peak demand, that's why we get allocated 16.5% of the costs. But if we mix in an energy component to it as well, then there's going to be a question of, okay, how much of the annual energy usage do you use throughout the year? And now that's going to be a portion, that's going to be an allocation, a factor that's leading to the allocation. So very much a lot of this is still up in the air. The 5 principles that I talked about are sort of, the driving principles that everybody's been able to agree to. The facilities that it's going to apply to, everybody's been able to agree to. There's still a lot of detail left to flesh out with regard to what the large load policy is going to be. How do we make sure that these large customers that are, sometimes projecting a doubling or a tripling of a local utilities load, how do we make sure that we're not building this transmission system to serve 40 or 60 years, but we only have certainty they're going to be around for 10 years, for instance? What portion of the incremental transmission investment should they pay for? And that's the large load component of CARE. This is the cost containment work plan, is already much more fleshed out. I mean, it's mostly, I know there's a lot of words on this slide, but this is basically, I think what they're intending to do is, I think they're going to recommend that the board require that any transmission owner that builds one of these projects as a short-term reliability project, that they have some enhanced cost containment and cost accountability, cost control requirements for those, sort of to emulate the benefits of competition, maybe without actually requiring the competitive process. And then this is the next steps. And thank God this is my last slide. So this is where we are. We're not quite halfway through the CARE team meetings, but you can see the additional in-person and virtual meetings that are on the calendar. I'll be at each one of those in-person locations as we work through the process. But we are moving rapidly from theoretical, sort of philosophical discussions about what people would prefer to see in a cost allocation. And I think, very rapidly in the next series of meetings, we're going to be refining and narrowing down those potential options, probably voting on in a straw poll fashion of what precisely people would like to see for cost allocation. But this is the roadmap. So yeah, it's definitely in 2026. Something is going to happen with regard to cost allocation for the overlay, which is, $50 to $60 billion of transmission is the number that I'm sure SPP isn't real happy about that I continuously say in public meetings like this, but anyway, that's it.
Justin, thank you so much for that. The care team part of it is very interesting. You've given us the conceptual outline and the boundaries of the major kind of a topical outline of what it is that's being looked at, what's being studied. You've given us the timeline there in that last slide. That is strikes me for the subject matter under consideration is not only necessary, but it's challenging because December is going to be here day after tomorrow, metaphorically speaking. It's going to be here very quickly, and with all the hurdles that you have before you there, especially considering the fact that if I understood you, you're looking back to 2024, 25, and 26 with respect to the implementation of these guidelines. Is that right?
Yeah, it's right. But just as a reminder that we're only considering voltage levels above 345 kV, right? So it's basically there's been about $20 billion of 765 kV that's already been approved. Or no, I'd say about 12 billion of 765 kV that's already been approved in the 24 and 25 ITPs. None of those lines are in service yet. I don't think construction has began on any of those facilities. And, we and many other stakeholders during the process, when those transmission lines were being approved, we were out there expressing concern and a recommendation for a full evaluation of cost allocation on those transmission facilities when they were being approved in 24 and 25. So, there's no retroactive rate making going on here, but absolutely, yeah, that's it. It's that entire overlay. And the schedule is very intense. I mean, I think this is the meeting cadence that we'll stick with, but just as a reminder, this is co-chaired. This is co-chaired with Kayla Hahn, Chair Kayla Hahn of Missouri, and Steve Wright, the independent board member on the SPP board. Both of the co-chairs are they've expressed publicly a desire to stay on track in terms of this schedule, and they've expressed the willingness to add additional meetings to this calendar if that's what's necessary to keep us on track. I personally think it's even with that willingness that they have, I still think it's going to be very difficult to actually get this done in this period of time. But in terms of the work product itself from the care team, I think there's a fair chance it could be done in December, but ultimately it's just going to be a recommendation to the entity that actually has authority over cost allocation in SPP, which is the Regional State Committee, right? So it's still got whatever it is we approve or recommend approval of, it's just going to be basically an advisory recommendation to the cost allocation working group, to the Regional State Committee, and ultimately the board has to approve it and FERC has to approve it. But I think what you'll see is that any notices to construct that come out of this 2026 ITP, it will all be contingent upon whatever ultimate cost allocation is approved.
I see. Again, I appreciate the granularity so much and the contextual references that you make to a lot of the moving parts here. But let me ask you. For me, it's a pick up the crayon question. For you guys, probably not. But prospectively, given what I anticipate is some of the other variables that you've addressed throughout the course of this morning, where there may be a proliferation of 345 kV lines, whether double circuited or not. why are not these same parameters being applied to 345 kV lines prospectively?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think there, I mean, it may very well be that the regional state committee takes that up next. You know, I would say that the desire to limit the focus of the care team to the overlay, to the above 345 kV overlay, is kind of twofold. I mean, one, it is the size of those portfolios, it's the size of those lines, it's the nature of some of the early 765 kV lines that were clearly being planned to rectify reliability issues and sort of you know, in geographically disparate areas of the system, you know, the outer lying edges of the SPP region. It's the first time that there was really any evidence. What I'm going to say is something that not everybody listening to this call is probably going to agree with. But the first time that there was any real evidence that there might be a problem creeping up with regard to cost allocation, with regard to, you know, the disparate differences between costs and benefits, was that 2024 ITP. Okay. Because for everything prior to that, you remember there's a requirement under the tariff. There is a requirement to do a regional cost allocation review every 6 years, and it used to be done every 3 years. And Kansas has had a very prominent role on, we've always had a commissioner assigned to that regional cost allocation review task force. And every time it comes out, it shows that Kansas is benefiting quite significantly from all the transmission that's been built in SPP. And so, you know, in the last one that we did was, Chair, do you remember when was the last RCAR?
I think it was, I want to say 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago.
So, but
yeah,
there,
it was pretty recent.
Basically, there wasn't a lot of new transmission that was really moving the needle that was coming out of these regional transmission portfolios after that RCAR. I mean, basically what I'm saying is, when the first portfolio that was really substantive and costly and really started to ask, you know, people started to question whether all of the previous cost allocation results were being upended. I mean, in other words, before 2024 ITP, there was no analytical evidence. All the evidence that had been presented was supportive of the fact that the region generally, everybody was benefiting from the transmission that had been developed. And then all of a sudden in 2024 ITP, there was an $8 billion portfolio, which was like half of all the transmission that had been built in the previous 20 years. And it had very significant, very disparate benefit to cost ratio presented, right? And so there's a couple things. I mean, one, it was like, from just the evidence itself, the lines that were causing the most concern for the most states all at once, it was all the stuff larger than 345 kV. And I think the other major factor was the desire to ensure that everything, all of the above 345 kV transmission that went into the overlay, we didn't want to jeopardize the ability to go back and capture the overlay facilities that were approved in 24 and 25 as well. And I think there was a recognition that if we limit this to only the facilities that are necessary for the overlay, that's defensible and justifiable, that you could go back and look at 24 and 25. Then again, I'll just say the RSC has retained its own consultant, which is Bates White Economic Consulting. They are right now, they are mostly following the care team process, and they're there as an independent voice to support the RSC in evaluating whatever comes out of the care team. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if the next step after the care team is disbanded is, all right, now let's evaluate 345 KB cost allocation. And there's going to be a big question of, is it prospective only projects that are built from this day forward? Or is it prospective in terms of revenue requirements that are collected from this day forward? Right. So,
Hey, Justin, I'll just tack onto that, because, you know, I was one of the ones that jumped on this once we saw that, the Potter line going down to New Mexico. You know, that raised my concern quite a bit, and I was one of the ones shouting to take a look at cost allocation. So first of all, to Commissioner Keen's question, I agree with Justin. I think there will be an evaluation of cost allocation for lower voltage classes moving forward. But I agree with Justin. I mean, I think the pace of growth, I mean, Justin alluded to it. Some people wouldn't agree with this, but I think the pace was not nearly as fast as what we've seen now as far as level of investment. And so I think we felt like we had some comfort that all the areas of the region were benefiting. The analysis was showing that there, and the costs were not as high. I think when we saw that first 765 line in such a discrete location of the footprint and not providing, it was billions of dollars and not really providing benefit to any other part of the region. I mean, that's when I became very concerned, because I thought, you know, the balancing of costs and benefits across the region could get away from us really quick if we just start approving individual 765 lines in discrete areas. And so, you know, to me, it was really important to look at those particular facilities. And so, and I think it is good to look at it in the context of maybe the bigger overlay and how that works. So I think they're going about it the right way. But ultimately, I would also say it's not intuitive that we would create a cost allocation for these larger 765 lines that is less regionally creates less regional sharing than what we currently have for 345 lines. You know, it doesn't make any sense that you would spread the cost of a 345 line across the entire region, but yet a higher voltage class, which should provide broader benefits, is going to be spread on a less regional level or a more localized level, which I think we may be headed toward. And so, you know, it's not to say that that's the wrong answer for the 765, but I think it does call into question whether we need to reevaluate the cost allocation for 345. So I also would expect that to be on the work plan coming up. So I just wanted to provide that additional context.
Thanks to both of you. Those are all the questions I had this morning.
this afternoon.
Oh, that's right. Let me start again. Let's go back. No, thank you. It's been a very informative update, and I appreciate always, Justin, the granularity with which you approach it, and I think the candor too. If the future is within a scale of reasonable probability headed towards some of these large numbers, I think we ought to hear or maybe heed the warning that may be coming down the trail, because as these things could ultimately work their way back through the transmission and delivery charge right into the ratepayers here, the potential impact prospectively is just staggering, actually. Realizing it won't happen all at one time and all the other caveats that you had on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm not sure why we chose, the longest quarterly update I've ever given to be, the week after I'd missed an entire week of work because I was sick. But in any
You did a
case,
great
we
job.
survived it. We survived it. So.
Well, Justin, is that I take it since you took the presentation down, that was the last topic, correct?
Yep, that's all I have. Thank you.
All right, very well. Thank you very much for the presentation and comprehensive as always, even if you were sick last week.
Mm.
Well, thank you for that. If there is nothing further to come before us, we are now at the end of our agenda, and I bet some people want to go have lunch. So I would entertain a motion to adjourn the business meeting.
I make the motion to adjourn.
Second.
Got a motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye, we're adjourned. Thank you all. Take care.
Take
Thank you.